USS Wichita, the product of an unholy union between a Brooklyn-class light cruiser and a New Orleans-class heavy cruiser. But what a union, and what a product of it. And sorry, I could not resist making that point. Because this is literally what it is. It's the US going, we've designed a really good hull. A really, really good hull. Light cruisers fit the Royal Navy's needs. But they don't fit ours. And it's a distance thing again. As I've tried to explain several times in different videos, and I'm never quite sure if I'm doing a good job, so feel free to ask questions and comment. But there is a very different geostrategic need in terms of the British building to fight a war in the Pacific and the Americans building to fight a war in the Pacific. Because the Americans are thinking about going across the Pacific. The British are thinking about going up the Pacific. Specifically, up the west of the Pacific. So the British are thinking about going up the South China Sea, East China Sea, those areas. That's the distance. That's the sort of operations they're looking at. They're looking at having bases as they go. The Americans are looking at going across the Pacific. Or across the Atlantic. The British also across the Atlantic, but then they end up in Canada or America, and they don't really think America's likely to be someone they're going to be fighting. There's always plans. They maintain plans. Both sides do. But that's kind of... well, that's for the same reason that these various organisations maintain all sorts of plans. I'm fairly sure they still maintain plans to this day, because you do. It's what you do as your backup. Like continuity of government plans, you have plans for every eventuality, including ones which are, this will be so bad, either surrender or just tell everyone to carry on and see what happens. But you have the plans. So the British were looking at fighting North Atlantic, South Atlantic, Mediterranean, anywhere there were their trade routes, they were thinking about fighting. And Japan was, of course, someone they were hoping to keep away from the vast majority of their trade routes, i.e., thanks to Singapore, Southeast Asia, Australia, they were hoping to basically block them off from going to the Indian Ocean, and thanks to the general, well, the nightmare that is trying to go around South America, especially from starting on the opposite side of the Pacific, and the fact that the Falkland Islands were sitting the other side, they were hoping to prevent them going that way, either into the Atlantic, and getting to British sort of shipping lanes. And they were fairly certain the Americans wouldn't allow them through the Panama Canal, but if they did, well, there would be a British cruiser force probably sitting in the Caribbean going, "Hello, we'd like to make friends of you, and as part of our friendship, we are going to greet you with many torpedoes." But the fact is, that's for the British. What do the Americans need? They need to be able to voyage into the unknown, which is where this unholy, unsanctioned, unconsecrated in many ways union takes place. They have this excellent light cruiser hull, but 6-inch guns for the US Navy. Well, the 6-inch guns are good. They'll be able to take out destroyers and other cruisers, but the trouble is, there's a possibility you're going to come running across a Congo. There's a possibility you're going to come running across something a lot bigger. And that's not good. That's not good at all. So that means you have to have something to even the odds. 8-inch guns, the best options for it. And this is why the heavy cruiser means far more. And when I say heavy cruiser, I know, of course, it's not really a heavy cruiser. Please note that, again, as I've said in various videos, heavy cruisers on the treaty systems are not heavy cruisers. They are taking the upper limit from what the Royal Navy described laughingly as a large light cruiser that was known as the Hawkins class. They were not heavy cruisers. The light cruisers come from scout cruisers. Or light cruisers. If the heavy cruisers come from large light cruisers, which means all the cruisers we have in World War II are really variations of light cruisers. So we have light and lighter, really. Anyway, these 8-inch gun cruisers, these heavy cruisers, as in the treaty terminology, are the best bet the US Navy has for doing all the operations they need, the escorting the carriers. Again, we've discussed this with the carrier. It was one of the videos recently on carrier design. And the point I made was that, well, tried to make, was that the actual design of the Lexington class with the 8-inch guns doesn't make sense under the Washington Treaty, because you can build as many cruisers as you want, and frankly having that amount of top weight and all the other stuff that goes with it up in a ship to get 8-inch guns up the position where they are is absurd, because of the difficulties that's going to factor into design. You can see why they end up going down that route, you can see the logic they followed. It's just at some point someone should have gone, why are we going to all this effort to put 8-inch guns this high up in a ship? Why? Why? And how useful are these 8-inch guns, and do we want the ship to use them? We can build extra cruisers. If Congress, of course, will give you the allocation for it. But we can also think about how good the aviation facilities on the Lexington class would have been if all that weight which was used for an 8-inch guns had been used for other things. Leaving that to one side, under the London treaties you do get a limit on the numbers of cruisers. So suddenly, those guns actually make more sense under the First London Treaty. By the time you get to the Second London Treaty, it's not making sense again. But the First London Treaty is where it sort of makes sense for a few years. These ships are, these heavy cruisers, like Wichita, and God, she looks gorgeous, doesn't she? There are some weird points there I'm going to point out before we get to the next slide. So I'll make sure that restarts. But these ships are supposed to be escorting the carriers. They're supposed to be ranging far and wide, doing the reconnaissance. They're supposed to be supporting troop movements, because you're going to need to seize a lot of islands, and secure a lot of islands, and supply a lot of islands. And that's what these vessels are for. Big enough, they can threaten something. Fast enough, they can get away from something. The earlier heavy cruisers really are scout vessels. They are so light, it's belief in terms of their armour. Everything to give them the maximum firepower possible. By the point you've got to these vessels, scouting is less a part of the function of the Wichita class. They've got 4 aircraft which can go off and do some of the scouting for them. But more important for them is the ability to be a nasty surprise for anything which comes across them. And they would be a nasty surprise. Wichita especially would be a very nasty surprise for anyone who comes across it, because you're going to be confused, because it's going to have the handling characteristics of a light cruiser, an established and understood light cruiser design, yet it's got the firepower of a heavy cruiser. It does have some interesting facts to try and keep it as close to 10,000 tons as possible. There is the fact that it carries 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch guns. Now, these 5-inch guns, you will see, one is mounted centerline here in the turret, 2 are mounted, I was just going to say abridge the bridge, either side of the bridge and the forward structure, and then there's one mounted centerline above the aft turret. Hang on, that's only 4 turrets, Alex, you pointed to. Why only 4 turrets when you just said there are 8 guns? Are there 4 twin turrets? No, those are single turrets. The remaining 5-inch guns are in open mounts. There are 2 reasons which this is done for. 1, to save weight. 2, because in the pre-radar anti-aircraft world, The main weapon you have for taking out aircraft is the Mach 1 eyeball and spotting with that. And if you're in a turret, you can't see that much. Yes, you might have directors. Yes, you might have all these things assisting you. But you can't see. You can only see where your turret is pointing and the view is pointing. Whereas if you're in a mount, you can go... I can hear something. Where is that thing I can hear? Seaman Charles, you have better eyesight than me. Look around. Well, yes, you eat your carrots. Look around. Spotted it? Oh, it's there. Okay. Okay, round. Let's... That general direction over there. That's where... It's not in range yet, but that's where it's coming from. It's scary to think about, but that was anti-aircraft fire control and direction in the 1930s, for much of it. Do you have some of a sharp pair of eyes on your crew? Good. Use them. Displaced 10,759 regular tons. That's 10,589 long tons, or imperial tons. 13,000 pretty much long tons as fully loaded. 13,224 tons standard. In, well, modern tonnage. Metric tons. Too many tons. It's one of those days. Too many tons. 180 meters long at waterline. 185.42 meters overall. A beam of 18.82 meters and a draft of 7.24 meters. Belt armor, 6.4 inches. That's useful because the belt armor actually gives her a strong capability to take a whacking. And when I say taking a whacking, well, it was found that as it was made of Class A armor, rather than the older armor which was used in earlier cruisers, by this point classified as Class B armor, against 8-inch guns, they had to be within 9.1 kilometers to penetrate the belt. That's 10,000 yards. For the previous generations, they only had to be within 16,400 yards. That's 15 kilometers for the belt armor to be penetrated at the same thickness. Wichita's deck. Wichita's deck. 2.25 inches. 57 millimeters. Was immune to 8-inch fire inside 22,000 yards. That's 20 kilometers. That's pretty darn useful. She also had a 7-inch amount of arm plating around the barbettes on the turrets. So the turrets themselves have 8 inches of armor. The barbettes they're mounted on are 7 inches thick. The barbette going down. This is a ship which is designed to survive and take a lot of damage. A lot of damage. Maximum elevation of the main guns was 41 degrees. 41 degrees. Which provided a range of roughly 27.5 kilometers, or 30,000 yards. Rate of fire was approximately 1 salvo every 15 seconds. Which is not that amazing, but not bad either. That's still, if we consider this nicely, that's gonna be 36 8-inch shells coming your way every minute, and that's not something anyone really wants to think about. 45 shells in the first 60 seconds of any engagement, if they're preloaded before they start firing. It's just not fun. The 5-inch Mark 38 dual-purpose guns, well, they could go up to, of course, 85 degrees, where they had a ceiling of 37,200 feet. That's a very comprehensive dual-purpose weapon. I've just done a video on the 4.7-inch and the British, because it was a Patreon question, what would happen if the 4.7-inch had been chosen over the 4.5-inch as the dual-purpose weapon, and what mattered for the British, and the big problem for the British in World War II was they were starting without a decent 4.5-inch, whatever, dual-purpose gun. It caused a huge amount of issues. Actually in service. The 4.5 was coming in service on the carriers, but that was as the between deck mount, which eventually is fitted to the battle class because they don't have an upper deck mount, which can be fitted onto destroyers, etc. Which is again why you have a reversion under 4-inch. But leaving that to one side, the 5-inch Mark 38 is a really good dual-purpose gun. They would fire a 55-pound, that's 25 kilogram, projectile at a roughly 20 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity was 2,600 feet a second, or 790 meters a second. At 45 degrees, the guns could engage surface targets at a range of 18,200 yards. That's 16.6 kilometers. In simple terms, the 5-inch guns could engage you if you were coming to hit them on the surface, before you, as an 8-inch gun cruiser, could penetrate their belt. Let me emphasize that. The secondaries could be engaging you for pretty much nearly 7 kilometers. 7.5, really, kilometers, before you get within range of being able to penetrate their belt if you're an 8-inch cruiser. So that means you're going to be being engaged by 5-inch and 8-inch fire. It's going to be a lot of shells coming down on you. The 8-inch are what's going to probably cause you the most damage, but the 5-inch coming down are going to completely clear your decks. Wichita was the first cruiser to be equipped with a new 5-inch 38 gun. Now, the Bofors 40mm and the Oerlikons get mounted between 1939 and 1945, and there seems to be a sort of interesting process going on them, because officially they're supposed to be mounted, that they are, how do I put this politely? I'm fairly sure the crew are very capable of getting their hands on any equipment they want. And sometimes I think they might get their hands on stuff before they're technically supposed to have it, and then it's just recognised that they have it. Reading some of the accounts. Because there are some accounts which go, she's fitted with this by this point, at this point. And I go, why are you saying it's fitted with this by this point? If it's fitted officially, we will have a record on the data for it. And you go look at the records, and the records go, at this point, armament has been updated to have this, this, this. But she's not in a yard at that point. So, the crew are resourceful, is my impression. I cannot prove it. And I don't think that, before anyone says this is besmirching their good name, I don't think any crew would consider the fact that they were resourceful and made sure they had the AA weapons they needed, necessarily before they were actually going to be assigned them, would be anything less than sensible and resourceful. And I don't think any officer who considered their chief, who probably organised the acquisition, to be not doing their job, would probably be an officer who'd be got rid of. Especially when they started to complaining about it to an admiral. So, he got you more AA weapons and you're complaining? There is a very good staff posting. Where? In Northern Alaska. We don't have a base in Northern Alaska. That's why I'm sending you there as the staff. You're going to set up the base. Enjoy. The base is going to be you on your own in a mountain. Safest place for you. One of the finest products to come out of the Philadelphia Naval Yard. I know there's a Brooklyn-class light cruiser called Philadelphia. I do realise it. And I do know there are 2 Mahan-class destroyers which come out of there. But, and I know someone's going to say, well, New Jersey and Wisconsin are both built there as well, as is Washington. Yeah, all lovely. Antietam, Princetown, Valley Forge, all built there. Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Chicago. Yeah, all built there. Wichita's the best thing that comes out of this yard. Probably since the Franklin. And for those who don't know which Franklin I'm referring to the 1850 ship of the line, which was 74 guns. That Franklin was a cool ship. Didn't get to do much. Didn't get to do much at all. Was laid down 1815, launched August 1815, commissioned October 1817, and broken up 1852. In that time, she served as flagship of the Mediterranean Squadron, flagship of the Pacific Squadron, receiving ship in Boston. She carried... I never know why people write it this way. I got a little note to my assistant. She carried Honourable Richard Rush, who was the US Minister to Great Britain. But for some reason on the particular Wikipedia page for the USS Franklin, and I have this note down on my system, it says as to England. England, that would be like getting a minister from another country coming and going, I am the minister to... I don't know, New York. No, you're not. You're the minister to the United States of America. Well, yes, but it's in... New York State is here, and I'm going to New York State. That's where I'm travelling to get to Washington. Actually, it'd probably be Maryland, wouldn't it? But no, see, it's just, no, it's the Minister of Great Britain. Anyway, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard produce a really fine ship, and they are a really good yard. It's one of the great shames I consider of the modern world that this yard is, how do I put this politely, no longer in use. It still is a naval inactive ship maintenance facility at the site, but they don't do any major construction. Sad. Sad times. Anyway, so again, this is a great picture, and you can really see those guns, which I was pointing out. The fact that you had 4 in mounts and 4 in turrets. I would say myself that if I was likely to be engaged by anything as a surface target, it's probably going to be the turrets more than the mounts. Mainly because they're probably going to get more director assistance, and it's because it's easier for the director assistance to come through in a turret than the mount. Although they did their best to try and inform mounts and pass information onto them, but mounts for some reason... mounts, you always have to be far more protective of the various mechanisms because they are far more exposed to the elements. But you can see the way she's designed with that, what I would call star secondary formation is starting to come in, and that's what's going to dominate US cruiser design throughout World War II, the star secondaries. You have the primaries laid out fore aft centerline, but you have the secondaries in a sort of star formation. And she's good like that. Now, she took part in a lot of duties prior to World War II. She's commissioned in April 1939. Well, when I say commissioned April 1939. February 1939. February 1939. April 39, she starts and arrives work, and she takes part in the commissioning and dedication and memorial service at the San Jacinto Battle Monument. Why do I have commissioning on 2 lines in my notes? Just trying to cause myself to have trouble. She then went off on her shakedown cruise. This time she went to the Virgin Islands, to Cuba and Bahamas. I must admit that must have been such a hard shakedown cruise for the US Navy crew aboard. To have to go and visit the Virgin Islands, Cuba and Bahamas in 1939. Must have been terrible. On the 25th of September, after World War II had broken out in Europe, Wichita was assigned to the Cruiser Division 7 of the Atlantic Squadron, based at Hampton Roads. She then starts taking part in neutrality patrols. In October, she ends up having to go into Norfolk Navy Yard for maintenance, which lasts until December. On the 4th of December, she steams off to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, arrives on the 8th, and there her captain, Captain Thompson, assumed command of the newly formed Caribbean Patrol. Again, hard life going on here. This patrol included the Wichita, the New Orleans class Vincennes, and the destroyers Bory, Broome, Lawrence, King, and Truxton. King, of course, is a Clemson class cruiser, Clemson class destroyer. Sorry, and some nice Navy patrol squadrons. And that's where she was for the next 3 months, conducting manoeuvres in the Caribbean. February 1940, she returns to Norfolk via Philadelphia, and she participates in further training there through May. In June, along with Wichita and Quincy. Why did I put along with Wichita? Took part in the Goodwill cruise to South America, Wichita carrying Rear Admiral Andrew C. Pickens, the commander of Cruiser Division 7. During this time, they visited Rio de Janeiro, and Santos in Brazil, Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Montevideo in Uruguay. Yeah. In June 1940, they turn up in Montevideo in Uruguay. Well, that's when they start heading down there. The cruise ended in late September, and the vessels arrived back in Norfolk on 24th of September. For the next 3 months, she served as a training ship for Naval Reserve midshipmen, conducted gunnery practice off the Virginia Capes, and in January 1941, she departed Hampton Roads for Guantanamo. Again, participating in more manoeuvres in the Caribbean. She just has a lovely time. And then in April, she joins Ranger Tuscaloosa, which I think, I seem to remember correctly, was another New Orleans class, for a patrol North Atlantic. Yeah, that's nice. You've got 2 heavy cruisers, a nice carrier. Well, okay, it's Ranger. It's a carrier. It has a flat top on the top. It's basically afloat most of the time. And the ship sailed 800 nautical miles. Well, to 800 nautical miles of Ireland. It's nice. We're going so far across the Atlantic. We are within 800 miles of Ireland. Okay. She then returned to New York Yard on 17th of May, went into dry dock on the 21st of June, repairs were completed, because again, she'd been at sea, and she starts wandering around with other operations. Now, in July, she goes off to Iceland as part of Task Force 16, Operation Indigo 2, which was the occupation of Iceland. Yes. This is when Britain hands Iceland over to America. She arrives in Reykjavik with Wasp and Mississippi. Yes. They send the mighty Mississippi, one of the New Mexico class of battleships. And Wasp, which was certainly an improvement on Ranger. with Wichita to Reykjavik. They landed US Army troops and fighter aircraft to provide air support. And you sit there and go, what do they provide the support against? And again, it's still the potential threat of the Germans just turning up and taking over Iceland. The amount of forces it ties down in Iceland is almost absurd for Iceland's size, but is completely proportionate to Iceland's strategic importance for the Battle of the Atlantic. It's really not something you want to have a fight in. And this is actually Wichita weathering a storm off Iceland. This is what it looks like off Iceland. It's not good to be getting that close together in a storm, and it's certainly not what you'd be aiming to be doing. Wichita actually returned to Iceland in September, and Wichita would be in Hafnarfjörður, Iceland, as part of Task Group 7.5, I think it is, on the 7th of December 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. That's where she is. She's in the Atlantic. And that's what she spends the most of the beginning of the rest of her career, beginning of her career of World War II doing. She's fighting in the Atlantic. She goes off to patrol the Denmark Strait. Thank you, Germany, for declaring war on America. You've just made the jobs far easier for their navy. And gets caught in another storm. And during this storm, she collides with the freighter West Noho and the British trawler Eber. She then ran aground off her ferry Light. The following day, her crew evaluated her condition. She'd only suffered minor damage. And this meant she could keep going. And she did keep going. She went back to New York Navy Yard eventually for some repairs. And it took about 3 weeks in February 1942 for her to be repaired after these things, but she'd suffered the damage at the beginning of January. So it hadn't been so serious she'd had to race home. On the 26th of March 1942, she's assigned to Task Force 39, which was to reinforce the British Home Fleet based at Scapa Flow. It was originally to be commanded by Rear Admiral John Wilcox, and included the Wasp, the battleship Washington, and the cruiser Tuscaloosa, and 8 destroyers. However, Wilcox was swept overboard in heavy seas. It's actually on the second day of the voyage. He's unaccompanied and without a coat on Washington's deck, the battleship's deck, while Task Force 39 was pushing through heavy seas off Sable Island. He had some brief conversations with some men on deck before they lost track of his whereabouts. At 10:31, Washington's crew reported a man overboard, and then Tuscaloosa sighted a man struggling in the water and took evasive action to avoid running him down. Task Force began a search and rescue operation. Mustering Washington's crew found no one missing from the ship's company or Wilcox's staff, and it gradually became apparent that Wilcox himself had gone overboard. The destroyer USS Livermore sighted his body floating face down in rough seas, but the weather prevented its recovery and it was never seen again. At this point, the other Rear Admiral of the task force, Robert C. Giffen, aboard Wichita, took command of Task Force 39. He had a full investigation. It examined 43 witnesses over the course of the next 7 days. No one had seen how Wilcox had gone overboard. There were some claims that he had seemed sad or nervous on the morning of 27th of March and exhibited unstable behaviour in recent days, but these are balanced by other witnesses who said he seemed to be of sound mind, and although he was known to exhibit eccentricities not common amongst naval officers of his grade, his behaviour otherwise was not unusual on the morning of his death. One witness believed that Wilcox seemed pale and white during his last few minutes on deck, and perhaps was ill, leading to speculation that he may have suffered a heart attack while on deck and fallen overboard. There have been many rumours, but none of them been substantiated. There have been even suggestions that perhaps he was seasick because of the roughness of the sea state, and had rushed to the ship's side to vomit, but had selected an area where lifelines were not rigged, and fallen overboard as a result. That could happen. Or it could just be he was swept over by water. You can lose your footing when ships are going up and down, up and down, up and down, even on a battleship. Even on a battleship. But this did mean that for Wichita, her own admiral, Griffin, became acting commander and pretty much commander of Task Force 39 for a while. And he wasn't that keen on changing ship. He wanted to be thoroughly sure before he changed ship that there was nothing planned on Washington about we don't like admirals. It's not usual to lose an admiral over the sea. I think the US Navy during World War II only lost 2. Or maybe it lost only 2 in history. I remember reading it somewhere and thinking, that sounds a bit excessive as it is. Losing even one of them sounds rather wasteful. They're rather useful pieces of mental real estate wandering around your ship. You tend to keep an eye on them. Have someone just watching them go, are you okay? Are you okay? Anyway, this once she's over in the UK, she takes part in PQ-16, well, the escort of PQ-16, QP-12, and of course, famously, PQ-17. Now, the convoy escort for PQ-17 included Washington, Wichita, Tuscaloosa, several destroyers, Victorias, and Duke of York. But they're being held back at a certain distance so they don't go into the prime sort of German aerial submarine hunting grounds. Because they're there to provide heavy support if something comes out. But Swedish intelligence reports that German departures, the German departures of a major task group, Tirpitz, 3 heavy cruisers, to attack the convoy. The Royal Navy, well, as we know, Dudley Pound decides to disperse the convoy rather than risk this convoy getting attacked by this major group. Because at that point, the battleships and the heavy cruisers that are supposed to be escorting them are back further away than they should be, because they thought the danger had passed, but they were doing their normal thing of covering the next convoy going back that way, and hang on, no, they're going to attack PQ-17. Can we turn around? Can we get there quickly in time? No, we can't, and also then that risks the American units, and frankly, King, if I loot and get any of his units damaged, he's going to get really annoyed with me. That's going through Pound's head. King really didn't want any ships, any heavy units committed in the Atlantic. He really didn't want to have anything there. It must have made him so unhappy when Victoria's turned up. Anyway, she then goes off after this scenario to take part in Operation Torch. And during Operation Torch, well, she gets to do a feat which not many other smaller ships had done. She gets to beat up a battleship. HMS Somali. She took on a Italian battleship solo and beat it up and won. Mainly she was firing baked bean cans as well as shells, and I think the baked bean cans caused the trauma. But that's another story. Wichita finds herself locked in combat with the Jean Bart, which was incomplete but still a battleship, laying an anchor in harbour, and various coastal guns. She and Tuscaloosa initially engage the batteries on El Hank, while Massachusetts, a South Dakota class battleship, was initially tried to attacking Jean Bart. Eventually, Jean Bart requires the attention of Wichita, Tuscaloosa, and Massachusetts. Because Wichita and Tuscaloosa mostly deal with most of their problems. But the battleship is proving disturbingly hard to sink, or put down, or stop. Can I have some help, please, here? At 11:28, Wichita was hit by a 7.6-inch shell fired by a gun on El Hank. This shell penetrated the deck and exploded below, injuring 14 men. They broke off the attack temporarily, and several American warships began firing on French vessels exiting the harbour. And then Wichita and Tuscaloosa closed on the port to engage the cruisers Primaudier and Goire, which were still in harbour. El Hank, which is one of the positions which is heavily fortified with coastal defences, forced the Americans to retreat shortly after 3 o'clock. But, you know, this had been all part of their attack on Casablanca. This is the naval battle of Casablanca, which is part of Operation Torch. Now, after this, well, she sent to New York for repairs. And it's already been too long. King couldn't let his best cruiser not be in the major war as far as he was concerned for too long. And so after this, she's sent to the Pacific Theatre, where she is assigned to Task Force 18, commanded by Rear Admiral Giffen, taking part in operations on Guadalcanal. She joins Louisville, Chicago, which were fellow heavy cruisers, and Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia, which were, of course, light cruisers, and the escort carriers, Shenango and Suwannee, plus 8 destroyers in the task group. On the night of 29th of January 1943, the task force was steaming off Rennell Island, watching out for submarines, and so Giffen arranged his cruisers and destroyers for anti-submarine defence, not expecting an air attack. The cruisers were aligned in 2 columns, spaced roughly 2,500 yards apart. Wichita, Chicago, and Louise, in that order, were to starboard. Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia were to port. 6 destroyers were in a semicircle, 2 miles ahead of the cruiser columns. And the ships came under attack from torpedo bombers. In the ensuing Battle of Rennell Island, Chicago is hit by multiple torpedoes. Wichita was hit by 1 torpedo, though it failed to explode. Now, the Battle of Rennell Island is one of those little battles which doesn't get talked about as much. But it is a good example of what can happen. The US Navy lost a heavy cruiser. They lost Chicago. But she was a Northampton class, which meant if anything really deserves to be called a tin can, it's probably a Northampton class. What's interesting is that the Japanese lose about 12 bombers. It's just one of those things. You think your attack's going to be one thing, you prepare for that one thing. If it had been a submarine attack, they'd have been well prepared for it. But it was then an air attack. And this illustrates the problem you have in any theatre, in any sort of war, and why you do not want to be a single focus of threat. If you are a single focus threat, you make the job of your enemy incredibly easy, which is why you have surface raiders, you have submarines, and you have aircraft. Because it makes the job of protecting convoys and protecting force movements far more difficult. She also took part in operations off the Philippines. She basically gets involved in Battle of Philippine Sea. She's the assault on Maratai at one point. She's involved in that. She does Okinawa, of course. Battle of Leyte Gulf. Well, pretty much everything was ready for that. She operates assigned to Task Force 34 under the command of Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee. She has an absolutely amazing war in terms of the breadth of things she covers. Post-war, her life is slightly less exciting. She departs Okinawa on 10th September for Nagasaki in 1940. I think it's 1945. Yeah. And she's one of the first major warships to reach Japan. escorted by a destroyer, pair of destroyer escorts, 2 minesweepers, and a hospital ship, Haven. Wichita is then sent to Sasebo on the 25th of September for 4 days, before returning to Nagasaki on 29th of September. She inspected the Japanese ships and harbour installations to ensure Japanese clients with the terms of surrender in October, and then is assigned to Operation Magic Carpet in November, the repatriation of American military personnel. She refuels in Tokyo before departing for San Francisco. She has sort of departed on the 5th of November, well, assigned 5th November, and actually reaches San Francisco on 24th of November. There she goes into dry dock. She takes repairs and modifications for further Magic Carpet duty, completed in December, departs for Hawaii on the 6th of December, reaches Pearl Harbor on 12th of December, and then goes to Marianas. There she loads servicemen from Saipan, steams back again to San Francisco, arriving January 1946, 12th of January. She then goes, on 27th of January, she leaves the west coast of the United States, bound for the east coast of the United States, transiting the Panama Canal in February, and reaching Philadelphia on the 14th of February. She's then assigned a 16th Fleet and placed in reserve. She's decommissioned in February 1947 and laid up in Philadelphia. The US Navy did consider turning her into a guided missile cruiser, but Boston and Canberra were chosen instead. She's a good ship. She is a really good ship. She's the product of a lot of work, and she's the product of a lot of development. But frankly, she's one of the best cruisers that she's the best treaty cruiser produced of any heavy cruiser. I think when you're looking at 6-inch cruisers, there is a real field of options. But I think with heavy cruisers, there is Wichita and there is Wichita. You can talk about others and go, well, they have more guns. Well, yes, but do they have as much armour or protection? No. Could they win in a fight with this one? No, because their gun, by the time they got in any way, shape or form range that they could actually do some damage to this ship, they would have lost themselves. And that's the point. Best treaty cruiser. Heavy cruiser. If you consider 8-inch guns better than 6-inch guns, this is the best one. For me, it's between her and, well, probably Glasgow or Birmingham. Oh, they are both very good light cruisers. And Birmingham does a nice line in scaring the bejesus out of people on a regular basis. But leave that to one side. Wichita. Spectacular. So, well, this is what we have in January. I do need to come up with another live for January. And here are the recorded videos for the next few weeks. And lives. So we have a live tomorrow, the logistics of colonization, both historically and interplanetary interstellar. I've got to rewrite that tonight. I did a recording of that for the Saturday's Long Patrol version of it, and I didn't like it, so I'm going to rewrite it. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and take care. I know I normally do put in a question at this point, but Wichita I don't really see as a sort of a question point. There is, I know, coming up at some point in this, US Treaty Cruises in War in Retrospect, Monday the 2nd. So I'd love to hear your opinion on the US Treaty Cruises, because I'm going to be covering that, sort of going through all the Treaty Cruises, and I really do see it as a step-by-step process which leads up to the Wichita. Because of the way, especially, she brings in the product of the light cruiser ideas in terms of the hull design and the shaping and the power arrangement, power plant, and then the heavy cruiser armament. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.